Good afternoon. This is Professor Aminah Dean with Critical Talk, and I am, in a way, excited, and in another way, hyper excited to be talking with a journalist this afternoon, which I'll introduce to you in just a moment. All of us have been watching, I'm sure, or peeking at the Democratic convention. We're now turning our attention to the Republican convention, but we're following also things in the news and what journalists are writing, what Fox News is saying, what MSNBC is saying, what CNN is saying. Sometimes wondering if they're all just been given different acronyms, but they're actually the same show. We've seen journalism come to support political agendas. We've lost our sense of what is investigative journalism, what are news readers, what are all of these folks. We see very limited and in some ways obstructive coverage of protest in the streets. So that and plus a lot of other things I'm going to discuss this evening with Professor Raza Rumi Ahmad. Professor, I'm sorry, Rumi is a Pakistani policy analyst. He's a journalist and an author. He is director of Park Center for Independent Media, which we're going to spend a little time today because, as you know, Muslim Network TV is independent media. And he teaches in the journalism department. And it's best to have a professor because then the scope of things we can cover is larger. He has done a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, it's far too much for me to mention, but I got to mention a couple of things. He's affiliated with the Daily Times in Pakistan. He's worked with the Friday Times, Pakistan's foremost liberal weekly paper. He's published in Foreign Policy, Huffington Post, New York Times, The Diplomat, Fair Observer, CNN, Al Jazeera, and it goes on and on and on. But let me not take up all of his time because I want to mine his brain, and we're going to greet Professor Rumi.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor Amina. What a pleasure to see you finally and meet you, even over the broadcast.
Oh no, this is my pleasure. I have so many questions about journalism that I think we perhaps can start with defining terms. Students have heard about, and others in our audience have heard about investigative journalism. They've heard about news readers. You know, you look at the evening news and all of them are cute, and you say, are you really a journalist or are you a model who can read a teleprompter? You know, we have seen some others who kind of do what those of us who are a little bit older know of as journalism, but it's not quite journalism. And then there seems to be the objectivity of the journalist is gone. So you talk to me.
Yeah, you've opened virtually a Pandora's box of both questions and issues that affect not just us here in the US, but globally these days. I mean, the problem, and I'll try to focus on the US because I moved here about 6 years ago. And for the last 5 years, I've been affiliated with Ithaca College and Cornell University.
Uh-huh.
And and the reality is that the media scene in the US is truly mind boggling and baffling. As you mentioned, I mean, first of all, what we need to remember is that it is heavy concentration of ownership now. Nearly five companies control almost all the media that we consume on the mainstream.
Five?
There's
Only five?
only five
Oh
companies.
my goodness.
Yes, it was 50 in around 1990, and over time they have been turning into these oligarchies. They've been buying out newspapers, channels, websites, magazines, So, which basically means there's concentration, like the inequality of wealth and income in the US, if 70 to 80% of wealth being controlled by just a handful of people, 1% or 2% or whatever the figure is cited. I mean, media industry has undergone similar transformation. So basically what it means is that this is totally corporatized media environment where the primary function and goal is to make profits, increase revenues, get more advertising, and thereby forsaking the essential principles of journalism, which is the serving the citizens' right to information and upholding public interest. And that is why a lot of these issues which have now come about and have been exposed by the pandemic, I mean, we knew about them anyway, but now they are more stark, inequality, lack of access to healthcare, millions and millions without insurance, millions homeless. All these issues have been here, but you don't see them on CNN. You don't see them on the front page of New York Times.
Right, right,
And that is why the media presents a very partial and a very manipulated picture of reality, what Noam Chomsky calls it manufactures consent.
right.
Consent with the ruling class, with the existing inequalities, power structures. And therefore, as you rightly said, you wonder, are you just a model reading from a teleprompter, or are you actually a an inquiring journalist upholding the truth or informing the public? And this is the real issue at the moment that we are trying to grapple with in the US. But it's a global issue as well. It's happening in India, which is another big country where more and more corporate power is acquiring media. It is happening in Turkey, Brazil. So surprise, surprise, wherever you have a rise of authoritarianism, you have also this narrow concentration of media ownership. There's a direct correlation now.
Right. So, but I mean, there's been an ongoing thing, as all over the world with this capturing, poisoning, killing journalists.
Yes.
I mean, there's so much of it. The man in Russia just recently, I don't know how they got him out of the country to somewhere else, only to figure out he's been poisoned. And I guess we wait and see if he survives. Here, there is an interesting kind of shutdown of media. In one earlier program, we talked about the fact, and even on TV, there has been, people are talking about the fact that our real investigative journalism happened at the local level, where journalists at small papers were, and they weren't small papers, they were really outstanding regional papers sometimes, were tasked to go out and look at a story. And investigative journalism takes a minute, which means that the owners have to have in their budgets something for investigative journalism. So I guess it gets easier to report on the cat in the tree.
Yes, absolutely. I think you just said I mean, you summarized it well. I mean, because other than what we were just discussing about the media ownership, in parallel to that development has been closing down of local newspapers,
Yeah.
of the vanishing local journalism.
Right.
So in the US, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of publications have been shut down at the local level. I mean, they say somewhere between one fourth to one-fifth of local newspapers have closed down, and there's a void at the local level, because and then what these big companies do is that they are the arbiters of local truth or local information as well. And this is one of the reasons that the title of our discussion today about fake news, that
Mm.
why are fake news becoming so widespread and so widely followed is has to do with the fact that the very essential part of community media and community journalism is vanishing, and it is vanishing because often it's unprofitable. So the big companies have no interest in running in supporting outlets where they're not going to make money. They'll barely break even. So that, and then also, I think the other problem that we have come across in the past few decades is the lack of diversity in newsrooms. So I was looking, 2 years ago, I was teaching a class and I did some research for a lecture, and I was shocked. I mean, I was shocked to see that less than 10% of newsroom staffers were persons of color in mainstream media.
Well, let me stop you right there because that is a great subject, and I got a story for you. Let's take a 1 minute break here. You have your tea, I'll have my water. Come back and pick up right there.
Okay.
Okay, where we stopped was so critical because I don't remember. The pandemic has caused me to lose time. I don't know where you were when this happened. There was a young African American man, and I want to say he worked for either the New York Times or the Washington Post. Um, and they had hired him, and the thing was, okay, now we have our diversity.
Yeah. Look at
And
that.
he made it, as it turned out, he was almost up, I think, for a Pulitzer or something. I'm not sure, but he fabricated a story because he felt the pressure to be on top of the game, and what he felt and they felt he could talk about best was the African American community, not report on foreign affairs, not report on governmental affairs, but they put him in a slot where he was supposed to shine.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. So first of all, it's about the slots they're given, the beats that they're given. But other than that, just the very fact that the newsrooms and the reporting, crew. I mean, they are. I mean, you have a concentration of no of white people basically, and what about all the other communities that exist in the.
All the others,
Yes, 40% or so, more than that, not just the African Americans, the Latino population,
South Asian.
the South Asian, the Asians, Arabs, I mean, and hence you have stereotyping. So that is why, I mean, it is only in these recent post George Floyd protests that you have a slightly better use of uprisings. Otherwise, I came in this country when Ferguson was. When Ferguson happened, and then I followed, and I was actually stunned to look at the kind of police barbarity and the way it was presented. So in the mainstream, it was being shown as these rioters. Riots are taking place, as if these people are indulging in something are completely off the mark. I mean, these are people who are marginalized, excluded, impoverished, kicked out from
Right.
the society, and then you paint them as villains, you know. So I was like, and
Exactly.
and for 5 years I've been studying this, and I look at the racial stereotyping. I mean, because I mean, I have these multiple layers. I mean, just like you, I'm a person of color, I'm a Muslim.
Right.
uh, I come from this country, Pakistan, which is now associated, with all things bad, and
How
been
would they know? They never report on Pakistan. How would they know what's going on in Pakistan?
yeah, no, they hardly. They will only report when Bin Laden is discovered,
Exactly. Exactly.
or what is to do with the U.S. forces in Afghanistan.
Right.
That's the only lens. It's world's fifth or sixth largest country, 220 million people. But
Right.
you never get to know about its people or whatever. You just get what the U.S. security
For
policy needs
yeah.
to know or needs to tell the public, because you have to manufacture consent for war. You have to manufacture consent for military expenditure, for the military industrial production,
Right.
and and it's a vicious cycle. So coming back to the newsrooms, recently Margaret Sullivan, who's a very well known columnist
Right.
for the Washington Post, she's done a great book, and
Right.
it's called Ghosting the News, and in which basically she talks about how more than 2,000 papers in the last 15 years have vanished.
Mm.
Local journalism is financially, all the publications that exist are now facing a financial crunch, and with the pandemic, it's
Right.
become even worse.
Yes.
Well, you don't have advertising revenues, you don't have that kind of money to pay to the staffers, and so these are turning into small information deserts,
Mm.
or and disconnected from the mainstream democratization
Mm.
ethos or process. And this vanishing of local journalism thereby has a direct impact on democracy itself, how it functions at the local level, in terms of elections, accountability, state services, the conduct of public officials, environmental policies, climate change, etc., etc. So, I mean, it climate change is actually taking place. I mean, it's real, number one, but more so in the US, you have multiple
Yes.
examples. California forest fires,
Yeah.
drought in Mississippi, drought in California,
And
where
they're going to have floods and
and
and hurricanes.
hurricanes.
But
Yes,
what you're telling me is that journalism is an integral and foundational part of anything that we understand as democracy.
correct.
And
Uh,
if we've passed thinking about the slippery slope, we're on the slippery slope towards something else.
yeah. Yes, well put, Professor Aldine. So it is not just the foundational part of a democracy, but I think it's a vital public right. So after the oligarchies and the vanishing local journalism and the manipulated news agenda, comes the other problem, which has to do with how there is hardly any public funded media. Look at the countries.
Point there. I never thought of that. You're right.
Yeah.
There isn't.
So in European countries, and I'm not comparing,
Mhm.
God forbid, the US with developing countries. So,
Well,
let
you might could after the pandemic. You might could make a case for that.
yeah, there is a case. There is a case. Absolutely, yeah. So
Mhm.
Canada, I mean, I'm 3 hours away from a drive to Canada,
Uh-huh.
spends at least 10 to 20 times more per capita in public media. The
Wow.
UK, the UK, the BBC that we all know, and it's it's a channel and radio and TV of record. We refer to BBC archives when we are doing our work. BBC is public funded. It's editorially independent, but it comes out of the taxpayers in Scandinavian countries, in Germany, in other parts, the countries which are comparable to the US levels of income and wealth
Right.
invest in media, public media, because they view information as a citizen right. And here, it is not a right. Here, it's a you have to pay for this cable, pay for this channel.
That's
You have
capitalism for you, dude.
totally Hulu, Hulu. I mean, now all these streaming services, and you have to subscribe. Okay, fine. Some local outlets do need that support. But imagine if public TV and public radio were to be invested properly, with grants from either state governments or the Congress, etc., you
Right.
would have a different scene. You would have a different media environment where these private interests would not rule public information process.
So you mentioned several times Noam Chomsky's book on manufacturing consent. Could you say just a little bit more about how manufacturing consent is necessary for a slip away from democracy?
So, I mean, in very broad terms, of course, basically, what we have, Chomsky's and his co-author, Edward Herman, what they've, looking at, reams and reams of media content, they basically came to the conclusion that mass communication systems, media systems in the US are basically ideological institutions that undertake a system supporting propaganda function. They rely on market forces, they
Right.
internalize assumptions, they indulge in self censorship without overt coercion, and basically they adhere to the propaganda model. And the purpose of that propaganda model is to basically seek the consent and manufacture the consent of the masses for the ruling classes and the ruling power centers policies. So if it's a war policy, the I mean, the worst example, best is the wrong term I use, is the Iraq war. When every day on the front page of New York Times and Washington Post, some anonymous source said, "Oh, there are weapons of mass destruction by
Yeah, yeah,
Saddam."
day.
Every day.
Yeah.
CNN, MSNBC, all other major outlets. And guess what? They went and destroyed the country. More than 1 million people died. Many thousands of US soldiers either died or affected. So
Right.
much of our money, that money, your money as taxpayers' money, which should have gone to health, education, infrastructure, went into these defense contracts and defense spending. And guess there were no WMDs. And now they said, "Oh, we lied, we made a mistake." Tony Blair said we sexed up the intelligence report. And guess what? Media was playing a central role in creating support for that war. They tried the same for Vietnam in the initial part of the Vietnam War. They did the same for the war in Afghanistan, which again is going nowhere. It's been, what, I think almost 20 years.
Forever.
Yeah, 19, 18, 19 years. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
and they're talking to the same Taliban whom they overthrew. I
They're
mean,
talking to their grandkids.
yeah.
Yeah.
But forget foreign policy, come to domestic policy.
Right.
So an illustration of this propaganda model would be how the health systems function in the US. So where you have public officials, so-called experts, even some doctors on mainstream TV and radio saying, health, you have to pay for health. Who's going to pay for this universal health care? And they come up with these disingenuous questions, which to confuse the public, thereby kind of preparing a consensus that you have to pay for health. While again, I would say in countries comparable to US,
Uh,
health right, just in Canada. Look
right.
at Canada, Germany, the UK, the Scandinavian countries, Australia, New Zealand, the only advanced and developed country in the world which spends a lot of money per capita on health, but
Hmm.
still has what 40 to 60 million people outside the health insurance net is the United States.
Yeah.
Guess how that has happened? That has happened because first the media weren't talking about it. Then they justify and rationalize private healthcare model, which is totally a profit-driven motive for the big pharma, for the big insurance companies, handful of insurance companies, monopolies that basically control your and mine life and our life choices and destinies and our families,
Yeah.
and exclude. So in my classes when I'm teaching undergrads or even the postgrads in at Cornell, the first question I ask them is, do you know how many people live below the poverty line in the U.S.? And trust me, Dr. Aldin, I'm not joking, and it's not something that I say with some relish. None of the students know about it.
Hold
And
on. We're going to take a break.
yes,
I know I caught you mid sentence, but hold that thought because that is so important because that's a question I asked. Let us take a break for a minute. This is Critical Talk.
lovely.
Okay.
Right.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay. I want you to go back with the finger in the air. Yeah.
So,
Right as we were with your students who don't understand the poverty line.
yeah, and I asked them, take a guess, and then of course they don't know about it. They Google or whatever, look at online references, and then I always tell them it's not your fault. I'm not holding you to account for this because you haven't seen this.
Mhm.
The public narrative, public discourse never mentions the
Yeah,
poor people,
right.
and they are what.
Except when there's a riot.
Yes, yes. So can you imagine in world's most powerful, richest country, the sole superpower, you have 40 plus million people who exist below the poverty line. I mean, they don't have enough food,
Probably more. Probably more.
and yeah, and another 30 to 40 who barely make it, who barely survive with just the adequate amount of nutrition or whatever. So this is absolutely, but the mainstream media would not talk about that because it would upset the existing capitalist order, and it would make people question, why is there such gross inequality and gross concentration, a vulgar, unacceptable concentration of wealth and power in just few hands? I mean, take the case of the Walmart company or the Amazon or whatever, 5 or 10 corporations, and then they also don't pay taxes. So
How about that? I'm
so
paying their taxes. But
yeah,
the thing that's interesting is that the pandemic has forced some hands,
yeah,
just as the protests that followed them has forced some hands. And but I've watched the media who was forced into talking about quickly shut it down. I
yes,
don't know if you've been watching the media today, But up here, I'm in Chicago, and north of me in Kenosha, uh, black man, a father, was shot in the back, not because he was doing anything wrong necessarily. The two people causing the domestic altercation were two women, and he was trying to intervene, right? Now, that has joined, I don't know if it sparked a renewal of people hitting the streets or what has happened, but then the next thing I noticed on the news was in Kentucky, hundreds of people in the street about Breonna Taylor,
That
because after all of this time, nothing is happening. So the media is really controlling our emotions about things. Shut it down, you can't find it anywhere. So therefore, it does not exist. There has to be another uprising, a protest, something horrible that happens for it to get back into attention. And I want to talk about two things in our uh, the remaining time. Is one, how how do we strategize to stop that? And two, your Center for Independent Journalism.
Yes, thank you. I was going to come to that. So I think I'll come to the strategizing. Maybe I'll reverse the order of your questions.
Go.
So, so what we do at the Park Center for Independent Media, it's a center affiliated with the Parks, with the School of Communications and the Journalism Department. But what we do is that we offer courses, and I teach one of them is in independent media, non-corporate, non-profit news outlets that exist in the US. So, such as your TV outlet,
Right,
or for that matter, you have Democracy Now, or
right.
Mother Jones, ProPublica, Truth Out, Truth Dig. There's a whole variety. So we expose students to these outlets. And we make them, study them, understand them, and how they report, how they present stories and analysis forward. And then we also train them during the classes to actually think of becoming independent journalists and setting up independent outlets. And one of my courses deals with that, where we actually do a practicum with letting students research how would they set up an independent outlet, how would they find money, how would they raise revenues, what content would
That's
grow.
my MBA in journalism.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It is. Yeah, the non-profit version of an MBA.
right, right, right.
Yeah. So yes, so partly that, and then we also sponsor internships. So each year, 10 to 15 students go to different outlets and become interns, and they firsthand learn the ropes of, in small outlets you're doing everything. Now you are maybe hosting the show, you're writing the emails, you're making the questions. You don't have the large teams that mainstream outlets do. So we do that, and then we also have a very regular feature called the Izzy Award. It's an annual award named after I.F. Stone, who was this great independent journalist of the
Right, right.
60s and 70s and later, and a dissident. And so each year we honor independent media outlets or journalists with that award. So these are some, and then we have a speaker series and research, etc. So some of that we are trying to address through this center. It was created through a very generous donation by the Roy Park Foundation, who kind of put in all this big contribution and donation in support of a generation of truth tellers, so that you create a good number of journalists. Now,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Now, coming back to the strategy, I think that's a very, that of course requires so much of coalition building and so much of, I suppose, networking. And these days, the digital media are providing that necessary fulcrum or support. I mean, look at the Black Lives Matter movement, how it has evolved and shaped. Digital media have played a major role. I mean, you have a local chapter in every town, in every
Right.
city, in every neighborhood, and you can organize. So it gives a chance of organizing, but of course you have to get out on the street. Uh, Twitter is no substitute for real advocacy and making your voice heard. But I
Right.
think in terms of our the academy as a whole, I think the neoliberal model of education has also been terribly, terribly exposed. With the pandemic, it was already cracking up, but now that so many colleges
That
and
is
this
so true.
and austerity, and I mean,
Hmm.
imagine more than half of professors and teachers in US higher education are adjuncts, have no have no benefits, have no secure jobs,
Right.
have really low income. I mean, and I only, Professor Dean, I wasn't born here. I only found out these things experientially, because when I moved to Ithaca College, there was a whole movement. The first movement was against its white president, who allegedly made some offensive remarks, or
Right.
and the college students and faculty were up in arms. He was removed within a year.
Right.
Then followed the adjunct lecturers and all. I mean, and their rights. So I think that model of education, because a lot of journalism schools, a lot of communication schools prepare these factory workers for the larger neoliberal media machine.
Right.
They go and they're great techies, but
Right.
the thinking part, the challenging part,
Not.
is is not always there, or is
Oh, it's not encouraged. Let me
it's
say
not
that.
encouraged.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think we have to look at that focus, and I think we also have to ensure that the whole purpose of higher education, particularly the liberal arts education, goes back to the fundamental, uh, uh, you know, goal of opening minds, of critical thinking, of challenging the existing structures that oppress us all, that affect us all. Whether you're in Chicago, I'm in upstate New York, or somebody's in Nigeria, or somebody's in Pakistan, or somebody's in Yemen, we all are in it. I mean, look at the Yemen war, for example. I
Right.
mean, nobody talks about Yemen war and the arms that the Saudis are using against hapless people of Yemen are made in the US and the UK. I mean,
Well, you gotta have a real live journalist,
yeah,
and that journalist has to have a medium.
that has to have a medium.
Uh-huh.
And so going back to the problems of media industry here, is that one of the reasons that the New York Times did a big story on the children, in terms of putting their pictures and all of that, but it did not build public opinion or influence public opinion, where people were going to question whether it was the earlier regime or this regime, that why are poor kids and the poorest country in Arab world is being bombed to smithereens for years, starving them. Millions of people have starved, thousands of children have died and are still dying of
Right.
hunger, of lack of medicine.
Yeah.
And so I guess going back to the model of education, I think it's very important. And I think it needs to also start at high school, with media literacy interventions, how to train high schoolers who can read and look through the media.
Well, that
That
means we're gonna have to change how we do education. Um, I came along as a STEMS person before there was a name for it, but now what? And I quickly realized that because of my major, we were pushed into science and more science and more science. I had no literature.
yeah,
So I have spent my wonderful middle age fighting to read everything I can read, right? Because there was no literature that gives you context and this and history and that. But don't you think we have to start younger and revamp curriculums to even because the kids are being brought up to go where the money is.
Totally, totally. The kids, those are the values which are instilled in kids from a very early, and that's what the society does. That's what all the social media is about, the and the entire consumer culture machinery that children at very young age are placed into. How many toys you have to buy? So kids are pacified by taking them to a mall so that they can buy these hordes of toys and become hoarders at a
Right.
very young age. They don't need all those toys.
No.
They don't need all that fast food that affects their health. So I guess school education and curriculum is very important. It is extremely vital to rethink the entire model of education. And also, this whole, I mean, every nation state, I mean, I come from a country where also we have the same curriculum issues, where children are brainwashed and instilled all these ideas about this imaginary nation. And it's the US is no exception. Kids are trained as this citizen of this imaginary nation,
Right.
which has a very problematic past, which has not
Put it
just
mildly. Uh-huh.
the genocide of Native Americans. It has slavery, it has exclusion, it has Jim Crow, and now
And they continue.
it continued through mass incarceration. I mean, again, going back to media, how many times does the CNN tell us that all these prisons which lock up, private prisons? I mean, the idea is abominable that
Uh-huh.
you put a profit on
Prison.
curtailing somebody's liberty.
Exactly.
The idea revolts your sense of justice, your sense of morality, that you're making money by locking a person in a facility.
But on
And
top of that, when they get out, their rights are not restored to them as citizens of this country.
yes, yes, absolutely. The voting. I
Yeah.
mean, look at what happened in Florida and Georgia. I
Right.
mean, in Florida, they reversed. Okay, they can vote, the felons, and then suddenly overnight it was turned back.
Mm.
And in Georgia, I mean, Governor Stacey Abrams
Right.
was was winning. She
Right.
she had more, but the guy who is the Secretary of State is also her competitor. I mean, how?
I mean,
What?
isn't that something?
Oh
But
my God!
Professor Rumi, I'm going to be presumptuous here, and we're 10 weeks out before this wonderful chaos called an election happens. And I'm going to ask you if you would join me in 5 of those 10 weeks with some other guests, because we've really got to strategize, hear what is happening in plain terms. I know you got other things to do, but I'm usurping your other things. And because we've got to hear some plain talk that helps us better strategize. We're late, but it's better late than never, I guess. I don't know, but we're going to try it anyway to talk about what is happening. So the next time I asked you to come on, I want to kind of, from a journalistic perspective, an analysis of what happened in the Democratic convention. And then
Sure.
after that, I want to talk about what has happened. Because I mean, I have my opinion, which is not a journalist opinion, and it's not a constitutional law opinion. I just have the everyday opinion. But I want us to discuss, what have we seen? What have we not seen? What questions were answered? What questions were not answered that should have been answered? That perhaps I can also get you to join us in this. We need a flurry of op-ed, editorial, and other kinds of pieces to get out there to bring people, I mean, or put on their mind what should be happening. Are you up?
Certainly,
It's a
certainly.
game. Are you up for it?
I'm up for it. It's a
I
pleasure.
love it. I love it. And I can't thank you enough, but I'm going to give you the last 2 minutes to say from your perspective what this audience needs to know.
So I think the most important thing I want to say, given the time, is that do not always trust the mainstream media, whether it's posing as liberal or
Mhm.
whether it's posing as on the right or conservative, because they both spin and they both sell a particular doctored version
Exactly.
of reality.
Yeah.
Switch to alternative and independent news outlets. You
Tell
know,
me some of those.
okay, so I think Democracy Now, their
Oh,
daily show with Amy Goodman, is an important, vital, everyday thing, because Amy Goodman, goes looks at topics that the mainstream media does not look at.
right.
She goes in depth. She has the right experts. And then I think for the younger audience, there's a good YouTube based outlet called the Young Turks. They're pretty,
I know.
they're funny,
They,
they challenge things, and I would say pro publica for investigative journalism, because investigative journalism has also been a casualty
right.
of this profit making corporatization. So pro publica does great investigative journalism, and then I would suggest Mother Jones and The Nation, two very respectable magazines and outlets that bring you in-depth stories and things that others completely will not look at. And then there's a whole list of other outlets. You can visit our website at parkindymedia.org, and there's a list of selected US outlets, and you can find them on climate change, on science journalism, on women's issues, on race, on color lines is another good website which looks at racial justice and issues of race relations.
Okay.
And so there's a big number out there. Just
But that is a good list for the audience listening now to get a start. I'm going to remind the audience that you will be back with us. I have no intention of letting you off.
okay.
Um, and you check your spam for me. Um, and I want to thank you for this has been one of the most engaging conversations that we've had in a long time. And I can't thank you enough for entertaining us here at Muslim Network TV. And I want to say to our listening audience, we are going to do some analysis and see what else it is that we need to do. Probably give Professor Rumi's students some homework, but we're going to fight the best fight we can fight. And this is Critical Talk with Aminah Al-Din, and we'll be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock with Jihad Saleh on African American Muslims and the political arena. Thank you.
Thank you.